Hi BookTube, it's Amy, and I think it's time for another Friday Reads. This Friday Reads is going to be kind of the culmination of a couple weeks worth of reading, since it's been about 2 weeks since I did a reading update. Now, I'm not going to include a couple of books that I did read, including the Beirut Hellfire Society and one other one that I attempted to begin reading that I didn't like and that I'm forgetting the title now because it was that memorable. So I'm not going to include a couple of books, mainly because I don't have them here with me to show to you. I went ahead and I sold them at Black Squirrel Books here in Ottawa for store credit. But I will talk about the books that I read in the last 2 weeks and enjoyed. And I'll also talk about what I'm reading now. I thought I would switch things up a little bit. Every time I film Friday Reads, I tell you what I read, and then I tell you what I'm currently reading or going to read. I'm going to start with what I'm reading now, because it's fresh in my mind. On the bus home from work today, I started reading Someone at a Distance by Dorothy Whipple. And this is in a Persephone Classics edition. I haven't actually read any Persephone Classics before. This just happens to be the first time that I came across a used copy of a book. So this was originally published in 1953. And it is an English language classic, a British classic, I believe. And so far, what it's about is a widowed woman named Mrs. North who lives all alone in a large house that's really too big for her. And she is lonely. She laments how her children live so far away. She remarks, what is the good in having children if they never spend any time with you, if you're all alone anyway? And she has an ongoing kind of feud or criticism with her daughter-in-law, scolding her daughter-in-law for not coming and visiting her more often, although her daughter-in-law shows up at least once a week, sometimes more, which seems like plenty of visit to me. But Mrs. North is lonely. Her husband has died several years ago, and she answers an ad posted by a young Frenchwoman, Louise, to come and live in her home for a set period of time. So Louise shows up. She is in England with the pretense that she wants to learn more English and wants to experience the country, but in reality she is fleeing a doomed love affair back home. The man that she is sort of in love with, sort of been having an affair with, is indeed engaged to marry a more wealthy young woman. And so she wants to get out of the city for a while, and so off she goes to the UK. And that is where I've left her. But the back of the book hints that Louise is going to cause some issues in the marriage of Mrs. North's son and her daughter-in-law. So I'm excited for that. Right now I quite like the writing style. Third person, and it's quite funny, the snapshots we get in these characters' heads. So I'm reading this. But earlier this week, I finished reading Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And although I did enjoy this one, it is one of those books where at times you get just a little bogged down with the references to science that are brought up in here. And I'm not the kind of person who can attest as to whether these scientific assertions are accurate. Perhaps if I were into science, I would find those aspects more interesting. But overall, it's an exciting story to read, and having seen the movie adaptation several times as a kid, of course I knew what was going to happen. Although the ending was a little different from the movie, so that was new to me. Overall, I enjoyed it. Definitely worth reading. I had forgotten that Ned Land is Canadian in the book. It's interesting because all throughout he's just referred to as the Canadian, the Canadian. But if you don't know the premise, it is about a professor, his assistant, and a whaler who are on this ship that's hunting this sea monster, and when they encounter the sea monster, they get thrown overboard and discover that it is not in fact a giant narwhal, a giant sea monster of some sort, but it is a submarine, which is, at the point this novel takes place, and at the point of publication, not something that was actualized yet. Although I believe that the idea of the submarine had been conceptualized and people had attempted to build them. I believe there were submarines in the American Civil War, some attempts at submarines during the American Civil War. But the kind of submarine described in this novel is the kind of submarine that we would imagine today, one that can go at great speeds and travel quickly and for several days underwater without coming up for air. So it really is a technological masterpiece. And these three castaways, so to speak, find themselves taking refuge on the top of this iron boat, this submarine that they have never experienced before, and they are rescued by Captain Nemo, who says that he will let them live if they agree to be his guests aboard his submarine called the Nautilus for the rest of their lives. And they discover that the submarine is manned by a crew. However big this crew is, they're not sure, but it's manned by a crew who have also sworn kind of an oath of loyalty to Captain Nemo and are quite content to never set foot on land again. And so they go all over the world. Captain Nemo wants to go to the South Pole, which had never been done at the time. He wants to take this secret passage, I think, into the Mediterranean that doesn't exist. They go under continents and so on and so forth, and have some pretty great adventures. And our narrator, the professor who is telling us this story, is a little bit torn here, because although he sees that it is his duty to his companions to escape with them, part of him wants to stay and experience all these wonders that no one else, apart from Captain Nemo and the crew, have ever seen before. So, pretty good novel, I'd recommend it. I'm also reading at the moment Victor Hugo's Notre Dame de Paris, also known as The Hunchback of Notre Dame in English. And this is the Albin Krashamir translation. I am about halfway through at this point. I'm just about to begin book 7. I started reading this. Biblio-Alice is doing a read-along chapter by chapter at the moment, and so I wanted to read along to experience her videos, but so far I'm not a big fan of it. I never saw the Disney movie as a kid, so I don't have that nostalgia factor. But I do understand from the notes at the beginning of this edition that part of what Hugo was trying to do with Notre Dame de Paris was to tell the story of the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris and tell the story of the architecture in that area of the city, which he does, but in some ways it doesn't seem to mesh with the actual story, which is about a gypsy woman and, of course, Quasimodo, who is the hunchback, who is the bell ringer at Notre Dame. So we have this narrative that is kind of interrupted in places for Hugo to throw in a chapter or a few paragraphs about the history of this cathedral or the layout of this city. And perhaps it's this translation, or perhaps it's just a flaw in the text itself, something that Hugo tried to execute but didn't do successfully. It just seems to me that the story of Quasimodo and Esmeralda is, or should be, something separate from this almost non-fiction characterization of Notre Dame. Perhaps this is just my opinion here, but I'll read on to the end and see what I think. So last week I read a couple of other books, one of them being Two Serious Ladies by Jane Bowles. And this is the only novel by this author. From what I understand, she had a quite famous husband, and both of them were interested in members of their own sex, but they were also interested and married to each other. So an interesting backstory there, which is why I think a lot of the story in this novel is below the surface. This is about women who are discontent with their relationships and also discontent with their relationships with men. It's about two friends, Christina Goring and Frida Copperfield. And we go back and forth in different sections in this novel, but we don't actually see these two women interact until a very short scene near the end of the novel, where they discover that they are very much changed in the years since they've seen each other. One of the women is very wealthy, and she lives in this big house all alone, and she sets out to have some adventures. She does things because they're necessary. It's almost as though she is trying to cleanse herself. We actually have this scene in the beginning of the novel where she recalls being a child, and she performs a baptism on another little girl that she's a little bit obsessed with, a friend of her sister. She performs a baptism that she calls a game, and she does it because it's necessary, and that's how she explains it to this other girl who she is infatuated with. And of course she grows up, never marries, bounces from man to man, doing what she seems to think is necessary. And she never really gives us an explanation for this. It's very much under the surface. Despite, being wealthy and being able to live however she pleases, at one point she's actually mistaken for a prostitute because she is going from man to man. But she also has a woman in her life who she actually brings in to live with her. It's very interesting. This woman, who is a friend of a former friend of this woman, comes by the house one day and says, my friend told me to drop in sometime and meet you. And they are so taken with each other that she invites her to come and live with her in this house. And we get the sense that this wealthy woman is paying for everything, and they become companions of a sort, until she also invites kind of a deadbeat artist to come live with them as well. And then she gets this idea in her head to completely change her life, and an older gentleman joins their little group, and off she goes, doing what she thinks is necessary, regardless of how unhappy it makes her or the people around her. So we have her, and then we have her friend who is traveling in Europe with her husband, and she becomes distant from her husband and takes up with essentially a couple of hookers. She ends up staying in this hotel with a teenage prostitute who she eventually becomes inseparable from. And we get that, under the surface here, she is perhaps in love with this woman, even though they don't within the confines of the novel, within what we see, consummate their relationship. But there is, brushing of body parts and so on. So everything here is very much under the surface, but it seems to be about two women who are unfulfilled in their lives. So I really enjoyed that. There was one more that I read last week, but I'm running out of camera space here, and I'm at 14 minutes and 23 seconds. So I'm just going to call it a day. Let me know what you're reading this weekend and what you've read this past week. I hope you all have a lovely weekend.